Report of Interrogation of Survivors of U-574, a 500-ton U-boat sunk at about 0425 on 19th December 1941 in position 38 degrees by 15 north and 17 degrees by 16 west. Section 1. Introductory Remarks. U-574 was one of 3 U-boats sunk while attacking convoy HG-76, homebound from Gibraltar. U-574 was sunk in the early morning of 19th December 1941 in position 38 degrees by 15 north, 17 degrees by 16 west. U-434 on the morning of 18th December 1941 in position 36 degrees by 8 north, 16 degrees by 2 west. U-131 at midday on 17th December 1941 in position 34 degrees by 30 north, 13 degrees by 45 west. In addition, survivors from U-574 were convinced that a 4th U-boat was sunk, possibly on 15th or 16th December 1941. NID note: this may have been the U-boat sunk by HMS Nestor on 15th December 1941 in position 197 degrees, Cape St. Vincent, 35 miles. In order to simplify and expedite publication of reports on the interrogation of survivors from U-574, U-434, and U-131, it was decided that as these 3 U-boats were closely related in their activities and were largely involved in the same episodes, reports on U-574 and U-434 should contain only such matters as concerns these U-boats, while all general matter should be collected and included in the report on U-131. In doing this, it is to be regretted that Stork's stirring account of the defense of convoy HG-76 cannot appear in full in any one report. This report on U-574 contains such extracts as concerns the sinking of this U-boat, and similar extracts appear in the reports on U-434, Confidential Book 405137, and U-131, Confidential Book 405139. The single success scored by U-574 on her war cruises was the torpedoing of HMS Stanley some minutes before she herself was sunk. It is clear from prisoners' statements that the sinking of the auxiliary aircraft carrier Audacity in the night of 21st December 1941 and of the SS Rückinge on early morning of 19th December 1941 was the work of another U-boat which unfortunately escaped. According to German wireless broadcast statements, Kapitänleutnant Bigalk U-751 was responsible for sinking Audacity. Section 2. Crew of U-574. The complement of U-574 totaled 43 in all and consisted of 6 officers, 3 chief petty officers, 11 petty officers, and 23 other ratings, of which only 4 officers, 4 petty officers, and 8 ratings survived. The survivors arrived at the interrogation center on 27th-28th December 1941. Little is known of the commanding officer, Oberleutnant Zersee Gengelbach, who did not survive, and no details are available regarding his previous U-boat experience. This officer, about 27 years of age, belonged to the 1934 term and served in the torpedo boat Jaguar in 1938. His crew considered him an able officer and a good navigator, which a petty officer stated is unusual at this stage of war among U-boat commanding officers, who are relying more and more on the navigational abilities of their chief quartermasters, particularly if these have had lengthy experience in the merchant service. At the same time, prisoners leave little room for doubt that Gengelbach was more feared than respected. He preserved very strict discipline, and on one occasion, shortly before the sinking of U-574, sentenced one of his midshipmen to 5 days' detention on board for not sighting an enemy aircraft before he had done so himself. Gengelbach frequently overrode the counsels of those about him, and was constantly involved in bitter arguments which proved damaging to morale on board. At the last, when U-574 was within seconds of being hopelessly lost, Gengelbach appeared to prefer to allow the boat to sink with her entire crew rather than risk capture by surfacing, which attitude was entirely in accordance with the orders of Vice Admiral U-boats. He was dissuaded from this course of action by Oberleutnant Engineer Lorenz after a fierce exchange of words. According to one prisoner's statement, Gengelbach had no intention of saving himself, was seen on the bridge without a life belt, and then, as U-574 was sinking, he threw himself into the conning tower and went down with his ship. The first lieutenant and torpedo officer, Lieutenant Zersi Eckhart Just, was born in 1919 in Hamburg, his father being a businessman in that city. He belonged to the 1937 term, and during 1938 as a cadet made a cruise in the Emden. In 1939 he continued his training at the Naval College at Mürwik and became a midshipman. He was promoted to sub-lieutenant in May 1940. He was judged to be a good type of officer, but extremely reticent. He was regarded by members of the crew as a true comrade in arms. One petty officer survivor stated that while he had had quite enough of U-boats, he would not mind serving in one after the war with Just, should he ever be given his own boat. It may be added that Just had contemplated the possibility of drugs to induce freer speech being employed, and for this reason he slept badly whilst in captivity. The junior officer, Lieutenant Zersi Fritz Prinz, born in 1911, whose home is Mecklenburg, is an ex-merchant navy officer, having sailed with the Hansa Line. He was a reservist and was called to the German Navy at the beginning of the war. He was uncommunicative about his first years in the Navy, but he stated that he had not taken part in the Norwegian campaign and that U-574 was his first U-boat. He stated that his primary duty in U-574 was navigation, of which he had considerable experience. He had traveled extensively, and was accordingly more enlightened than the regular U-boat officer. He was not without a sense of humor. Oberleutnant Engineer Erich Lorenz, who was alleged by prisoners to have committed suicide by shooting himself after an altercation with Gengelbach while U-574 was sinking, was of the 1936 term. In 1938 he was promoted to lieutenant engineer sub-lieutenant and was then attending the officers' course at the Naval College at Kiel. Nothing is known of his service since that date. He was possibly at Memel in June 1940, when a notice announcing his engagement appeared in the local newspaper. He was married at Kiel on 8th April 1941. Lorenz was well liked by prisoners, one of whom stated that those who survived owed their lives to him, as it was he who insisted that Gengelbach should surface the U-boat when all seemed lost. According to prisoners, Lorenz remained behind after the order "abandon ship" had been given, and shot himself after opening the flooding valves. At the time of sinking, he was known to have been suffering great pain from stomach ulcers, which had developed during the cruise. For some days he had been unable to eat any food at all. U-574 carried 2 midshipmen for training, Fenrich der See Rau and Fischer. Rau was born in 1922 and joined the Navy in October 1940 as a volunteer. He spent 3 months training at Stralsund and then joined a minesweeper flotilla, with which he remained until May 1941. He was then drafted to a midshipman's training school, but he refused to say how long he was there or where the school was situated. Rau had been a member of the Hitler Youth and was a typical product of that unsavory organization. He was of immature intellect, obstinate and conceited. His conversation offered nothing apart from the customary trite propaganda phrases, and he was callow enough to remark that his greatest grief following the sinking of his U-boat was the loss of so many beautiful gramophone records. Fischer was born in Bielefeld, Westphalia, in 1922. His father, who was a Protestant pastor, had apparently fought and lost an unequal battle with the party authorities over his son's education. Fischer proved extremely Hitler-minded and had joined the Navy in 1940 but refused to give any details of his service. He was security-conscious and obstinate to a degree, and was useless for interrogation purposes. He seemed lacking in professional ability, and, being about 6 foot 4 inches tall, may have outgrown his strength. Of the 4 petty officers who survived, a boatswain's mate, who was an ex-merchant seaman, had served some months in a concentration camp, as well as a term in prison, both for suspected treasonable activities. This man professed his innocence of the charges brought against him, but he proved more talkative than the rest of the survivors, and there appeared no doubt that he still bore a grudge against the party authorities. An account of his experience while in prison and concentration camp will be included in the report on U-131, Confidential Book 405139. None of the surviving petty officers had been in the U-boat service earlier than December 1940. Some of the petty officers expressed the opinion that Atlantic U-boat warfare was becoming less profitable due to more effective countermeasures being taken, and they were perturbed at the increasing losses of U-boats. The rest of the crew bore out an observation made recently by interrogating officers that it is now the more experienced ratings who are becoming communicative, and the younger men, fresh from the Hitler Youth, who are the more stubborn and intractable. This is a recent trend which is considered of some interest. The survivors were noticeably more pessimistic than those captured as recently as 6 months ago. One rating went so far as to state that the war would last 2 years, when Germany would be defeated, and that he and his fellow prisoners would be castrated when they arrived home and be sent to Siberia. Prisoners spoke well of the treatment they received aboard the British warship, which brought them to England. Interrogating officers had no reason to complain that the prisoners had been spoilt for intelligence purposes, but it was obvious that they had received the customary detailed security training as to how to conduct themselves should they be made captive. German naval authorities continue to pay much attention to such training. Recent prisoners have referred frequently to their rights as laid down by the Geneva Convention, according to which they are only obliged to divulge their names and official numbers. Due to their privileges under the above convention, and to the oath binding them to secrecy which they have repeatedly been required to take, the majority of prisoners have refused to answer even the most innocent questions. Section 3. Early History of U-574. U-574, a 500-ton Type 7C U-boat, identical with the captured U-570, now HMS Graf, was built at the Blohm and Voss yards at Hamburg. U-574 was commissioned about the 15th June 1941, exactly 1 month after U-570. It is therefore probable that U-574 was launched approximately 1 month after U-570. The date of launching of the latter boat being 15th April 1941. These boats belonged to the series of U-551 to U-643, the first of which were laid down during the latter half of 1940. As a rule, Blohm and Voss built boats are commissioned every Thursday. This yard has had under construction the series U-551 to U-643, of which boat up to U-603 have probably already been completed. The boats up to and including U-573 are known to have been commissioned on consecutive Thursdays, U-573 on 5th June 1941, so that U-574 might have been expected to have been commissioned on Thursday, 12th June 1941. A prisoner stated that 10 stokers were drafted to U-574 on 6th and 7th April 1941 to stand by the U-boat during the final stages of her construction. Other members of the crew came on board as from 1st May 1941 until or about 15th June 1941. The date of commissioning the total complement was made up. According to prisoners, U-574 left Hamburg almost immediately for Kiel, which was to be her base for initial trials. At Kiel, representatives of the U-Boat Acceptance Commission came on board, and under their supervision, U-574 spent about 14 days carrying out acceptance trials, proceeding to sea nearly every day. After this period, U-574 was docked at Deutsche Werk Kiel for a further 2 weeks while underwater fittings were overhauled. On about 15th July 1941, U-574 left Kiel for tactical exercises and torpedo trials. The firing of torpedoes was carried out, as is customary, off Warnemünde, U-574 being alone at this time. It was alleged that torpedoes were only loaded while the U-boat was on the surface. After just over 14 days at sea, U-574 returned to Kiel, where she put into the Germaniawerft, or the Deutsche Werk, where further adjustments were made. Prisoners differ as to the length of this stay in Kiel, and as to the nature of trials which immediately followed. One prisoner stated that U-574 docked again and on 2nd August 1941 for 2 or 3 weeks, and then carried out further torpedo firing off Danzig. A second maintained that after a few days at Kiel, U-574 left for Horten, Norway, where there were other U-boats, and where U-574 practiced diving exercises for about 14 days. It was agreed by prisoners that in September 1941, U-574 was back at Kiel. Towards the end of September or early October 1941, U-574 left Kiel for Pillau, calling at Gottenhafen for 2 days en route. She remained 2 weeks in this area, where more diving trials were carried out and 8 torpedoes were fired, and then proceeded to Königsberg, where overhauls were effected while the U-boat was lying at the Elbing-Werft. From Königsberg, U-574 returned to Kiel, arriving on or about 8th November 1941. One prisoner stated that while in Kiel, mine laying was exercised, 2 mines being loaded into each tube. No mines were later carried in the U-boat during her war cruises. In the early days of November, U-574 embarked stores and 14 torpedoes, 12 being electric. These were stowed within the boat, and 2 air torpedoes. These were housed in the upper deck containers. Here in Kiel, U-574 also completed with oil fuel. Section 4. First War Cruise of U-574. U-574 sailed from Kiel on her first war cruise on or about 13th November 1941 at 0600. She proceeded to the North Sea via the Skagerrak, escorted by 2 patrol vessels believed to be converted trawlers, and headed northwards, hugging the Norwegian coast. Prisoners stated that when 3 days out, they put into a Norwegian fjord, possibly that leading to Kristiansand, where they lay for 1 night. The U-boat had no contact with the shore whatsoever, nor with any other ship. Proceeding north, U-574 was again accompanied by 2 patrol vessels, which escorted her past what appeared to one prisoner to be the entrance to a Norwegian harbor. Arriving at the latitude of Bergen, U-574 turned west and reached the Atlantic, passing between the Shetlands and the Faroes on 18th or 19th November 1941. It would appear from prisoners' statements that U-574 was bound on a special mission, accompanied by other U-boats, one of which eventually proved to be U-434. The purpose of this mission was alleged to be the destruction of a convoy assembling off Halifax, Nova Scotia. Approaching to within 24 hours of Newfoundland, U-574 ran into very bad weather, which had in fact impeded her all the way across the Atlantic. Shortly afterwards, orders were received from Vice Admiral U-boats that the proposed attack was to be abandoned, and that the U-boats involved were to return to French harbors, with the exception of U-574, which had not expended any torpedoes, and which was first to make for an operational area off the Azores before proceeding to Brest. This pleased the crew, for they imagined they would easily reach land in time to be home for Christmas. NID note: it was subsequently ascertained that U-434 also proceeded direct to the Azores. On 24th November 1941, U-574 put about, and on 28th November 1941 had arrived off the Azores. Here, U-574 received a report from Vice Admiral U-boats of the presence of a southbound convoy in the immediate neighborhood. For 2 days she attempted to approach this convoy, but was driven off by a destroyer and forced to dive between 1800 and 2300 on the 2nd day. After this incident, U-574 had a meeting with U-434, Captain Lieutenant Haida, on 2nd December 1941. NID note: this convoy was OS-12, which was approaching the Azores on 29th November 1941. Londonderry and Sennen, whilst rounding up stragglers astern of the convoy on 30th November, sighted a number of U-boats in the vicinity of the Azores. Londonderry managed to cause 2 of these to dive by her gunfire, the last at about 1600, but no closer contacts were made. A prisoner stated that on this occasion, U-574 received a secret communication which was floated across from U-434 in a life jacket towed by a light line, this method being employed owing to adverse weather conditions. According to a reliable petty officer prisoner, this message contained instructions for U-574 to proceed to Vigo, where she would receive oil and fuel and supplies from a German ship moored in Vigo Bay. She was then to return to the Azores and remain at sea for a further 6 weeks, if she had not meanwhile expended all her torpedoes. This prisoner said that the effect of this message on the crew was deplorable. The battering they had received in the North Atlantic had already been more than enough for inexperienced ratings on their first cruise, and the majority were sick and ill. In addition, everyone had been looking forward to Christmas at home. A possible 10 weeks at sea in the Atlantic in midwinter in miserably confined quarters would have been enough to exhaust the stamina of even the most hardened crew, and the petty officer could only explain the necessity of blaming the lack of available U-boats for use in Atlantic patrols. There appeared to have been some murmurs of dissent, which were rigidly suppressed by Gengelbach, who had at once headed the U-boat towards Vigo. At this stage, the voyage fuel had run so low that U-574 was not able to proceed at more than 5 knots on the surface, using only 1 diesel. U-574 used territorial waters off the Azores, where Gengelbach allowed the crew on deck to view a mountain, and again when traveling up the Portuguese coast. While in Portuguese territorial waters, U-574 sighted 2 merchant ships which were shadowed and would have been attacked had they not proved to be Spanish. U-574 arrived at Vigo on or about 13th December 1941 at 2200. U-574 entered Vigo Bay under cover of darkness and made fast on the seaward side of a German merchant ship which herself was moored parallel with the shore. Thus screened, U-574 was out of sight of land. According to prisoners' accounts, a Spanish destroyer was also in the bay, together with a few patrol vessels. It was stated that it was a general practice for U-boats to dive should any patrol vessel approach too near when the clandestine operation of transferring supplies was being carried out in Vigo Bay. Prisoners were uncertain as to the identity of the German vessel, the name being painted over, but according to an engine room rating, she was the Bessel, a small but modern ship belonging to the Neptune line. NID note: the Bessel, 1,878 tons, belonging to the Neptune line, is known to have been lying in Vigo Bay at this time. On 27th November 1941, she received 3 lorry loads of provisions. It was generally believed by prisoners that Bessel had been at Vigo since the outbreak of war, and there appears to be no doubt that she has been used by U-boats on a number of occasions. One prisoner who stated that he had visited the Bessel at Vigo whilst in another U-boat alleged that the master periodically scoured Spain for provisions, adopting the guise of a civilian corn chandler for such excursions. The master was reputed to be in close contact with the Gestapo. Another prisoner declared that the German ambassador to Spain was present in the Bessel when U-574 arrived for supplies. The main items transferred were fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit. In addition, it was stated that U-574 completed with 100 cubic meters, about 90 tons, of fuel oil. Prisoners stated that the crew of Bessel, who wore overalls, were not allowed on board U-574. They learned, however, that the merchant seamen were allowed ashore daily, but were ordered to catch the last Liberty boat, which left Vigo Pier, at 23:30. Failure to catch this boat meant stoppage of pay and leave for 14 days. According to one prisoner's account, Gengelbach, who anticipated that he would receive fresh orders to proceed to the Mediterranean, requested a complete set of appropriate charts from Bessel, as he had none suitable on board his U-boat. One prisoner actually boarded Bessel. As a parting present, each man of the U-boat's crew received a bottle of beer. At 03:30 on 14 December 1941, U-574 cast off from Bessel and proceeded to sea, having remained alongside for approximately 5.5 hours. The shortness of this stay was obviously dictated by the urgent necessity to clear Vigo Bay before dawn. Section 5. Last Cruise of U-574. Leaving Vigo, U-574 proceeded to the western approaches of Gibraltar, where she intended to remain for a short period before making for an operational area off the Azores. She had been advised by Vice Admiral U-boats that a British cruiser was shortly to leave Gibraltar Harbor, and she had orders to attempt to torpedo this warship before proceeding. The spirits of the crew were still downcast and listless. On 15th December 1941, U-574 received a signal from a Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft that a homeward-bound British convoy had reached a position just west of Gibraltar. NID note: this convoy proved to be HG-76. According to a petty officer prisoner, this signal was received direct from the aircraft and not through the agency of Vice Admiral U-boats. The evening heard of the presence of the convoy and were proceeding to intercept. On 16th December 1941, two further signals giving the position of the convoy were received, one from a Condor aircraft and one from U-131, Corvette Capitaine Baumann, who had apparently first sighted the convoy and was in touch without attacking, in order first to draw other U-boats to the scene. Both members of the crew stressed the perfect cooperation between aircraft and U-boats on this occasion. NID note: if this prisoner's testimony is correct, it would appear that the methods of communication between Condor aircraft and U-boats, and between shadowing U-boats and other U-boats known to be near enough to join in the attack, have been modified. See Confidential Book 405131, Chapter 16. According to one prisoner, it was first noticed at about this time that a U-boat, believed to be one of 750 tons, had ceased to signal. The only explanation those on board U-574 could agree upon was that this U-boat had definitely been sunk. Prisoner was unable to definitely state the number of this boat or the name of her commanding officer. NID note: this boat may have been the U-boat sunk by HMS Nestor on 15th December 1941 off Cape St. Vincent. There were no survivors, and the number of this boat is therefore unknown. According to prisoners, U-574 first came up with the convoy HG-76 on the morning of 17th December 1941. Of this day, Stork reports that at 12:47 Stanley sighted an object on the horizon bearing 130 degrees. Stork, believing that this was the U-boat dealt with next morning. NID note: it would appear that this U-boat was in point of fact U-574. The U-boat sunk on the morning of 18th December 1941 proved to be U-434. Stanley's first report was, however, shortly followed by a second submarine on the surface bearing 060 degrees, and attention was concentrated on this U-boat, which later proved to be U-131, and was referred to by Stork as U-boat A. Blankney, Exmoor, Stanley, Stork, and Penstamen proceeding at full speed to attack. At 13:07, a relief fighter flown off from the auxiliary aircraft carrier Audacity, in company with the escort to whom the U-boat's position had been given, dived on the U-boat and was shot down. This incident was observed by U-574 shortly before she submerged. A prisoner stated that at the time Gangelbach and a midshipman named Fisher were on the conning tower, and that Gangelbach sentenced Fisher to 5 days' detention on board for not sighting the British aircraft before he himself had done so. NID note: Operations which immediately followed and which led to the destruction of U-131 Corvette Captain Baumann are contained in the report on that U-boat. U-574 had dived during the attack on U-131 and remained submerged throughout the afternoon while Exmoor and Blankney searched for her in the position first reported by Stanley. According to a prisoner, U-574 again surfaced at 1800 on 17th November 1941 and sighted the convoy in the distance, but lost contact almost immediately due to a rain squall. In making towards the expected position, lookouts suddenly sighted a corvette, and U-574 dived again and was unable to regain contact until the following evening. Prisoners of U-574 apparently knew nothing of the destruction of U-434, referred to by Stork as U-Boat B, on the morning of the 18th December 1941. See Confidential Book 405137. They stated that their next contact with the convoy was at 1600 on 18th December when they sighted a large freighter. They pursued on the surface and after a short time noticed a 750-ton U-boat, of which they did not know the number, had also joined the chase. They were about to fire torpedoes at approximately 1700 when the freighter suddenly altered course, making an approach from a difficult angle necessary. They were carrying out this maneuver when two corvettes were sighted steering towards. Allowing for the discrepancies in German and British time, it is possible that U-574 was the U-boat sighted at dusk on 18th December 1941 by Penstemon, 8 to 10 miles on the port beam of the convoy, then in position 37 degrees by 15 north, 16 degrees by 57 west, which she was ordered to attack with convolvulus. Stanley, who had been investigating a merchant ship nearby, joining in on her own initiative. It was reported by Stork that the U-boat was chased and later dived, the force being ordered to remain in the vicinity as long as there remained any chance of sinking her, and then to rejoin. The search was abandoned at 21:36, Stanley ordering the forces to rejoin. During the search, torpedoes had been fired at Convolvulus. Prisoners from U-574 stated definitely that these torpedoes were not fired from their boat. Section 6. Sinking of U-574. According to prisoners, U-574 had surfaced at 1900 hours German time on 18th December 1941 and followed convoy HG-76 until 0200 on 19th December 1941, when a number of ships came into sight. After approaching close, U-574 dived and maintained contact with the convoy, aided by the large number of propeller noises recorded by the hydrophones. Shortly before 0400, U-574 rose to periscope depth, but as Gengelbach was unable to see anything at all, he ordered U-574 to surface. To the general consternation of the U-boat's crew, they now found that owing to a miscalculation, they were in the closest proximity to the convoy. Much too close for comfort, as one prisoner said. According to a petty officer prisoner, a number of merchant ships passed to starboard, followed by two warships which he learnt later to have been Stork and Stanley. This prisoner stated that they first wished to torpedo Stork, but she was traveling too quickly and altered course at the critical moment. Stanley came next within range, estimated at approximately 1,200 yards, and a salvo of 3 torpedoes was fired from the first, third, and fourth bow tubes. There followed what was described as a terrifying flash of flame, which set the sea on fire, silhouetting U-574 against the night. Prisoners stated that they heard 2 detonations, which may have been either from 2 torpedoes or from one torpedo and a boiler explosion. U-574 turned away, proceeded at full speed on the surface for about 5 minutes, observed that she was being chased by Stork, and dived to a depth of 360 feet. NID note: from the evidence of the hunt, it is plain that U-574 remained at a shallow depth, and this statement appears to have been made in a deliberate attempt to mislead. Stork, in her report, states that Stanley's position at the time of the attack was right astern on the outer screen. At about 03:45 on 19th December 1941, Stanley had made by radio telegraph, "Submarine in sight." Having very little idea of her exact position, Stork ordered her to indicate her whereabouts by illuminant, but she shortly afterwards amended her signal by RT to "Torpedoes passing astern." Stork sighted Stanley shortly afterwards about 1.5 miles on her port quarter. She made her pennants twice by light, and Stork was replying when Stanley went up, literally in a sheet of flame several hundred feet high. It was reported later that Torpedoes had passed astern of Stork at about the same time. Prisoners alleged that they did not know whether any other U-boats were in the vicinity at this time, but they were quite certain that only 3 torpedoes were fired from U-574. Stork reported that Stanley was torpedoed at 0409. Stork turned 16 points to port at full speed, ordered escorts to carry out a 36th Escort Group operation, Buttercup astern, and, when abreast the wreck, to commence dropping depth charges in accordance with that order. AS contact was quickly obtained, fine on the port bow, and Stork went into attack at 15 knots, and dropped 5 depth charges set at 50 feet. These were dropped slightly late, owing to the last-minute decision to fire a pattern instead of single charges. Stork then ran out for about 1,000 yards, turned and attacked again, this time with a 10-charge pattern, settings 50 and 140 feet. This attack appeared excellent from the Asdic point of view. In U-574, depth charges dropped during the second attack exploded immediately above the U-boat and were considered fatally accurate. Both main electric motors were put out of action, the port motor temporarily, but the starboard one permanently, as fuses were blown, causing a short circuit which burnt through vital cables, and a small fire broke out in the control room. One group of compressed air bottles was shattered, a rib supporting the pressure hull fractured, and the torpedo angling gear came adrift aft. A certain amount of water entered the boat. According to prisoners, there followed an altercation between Gengelbach and Lorenz, the engineering officer. It was apparent to Lorenz that the U-boat was doomed, and that if anyone was to come out alive, it was imperative to surface immediately. Gengelbach, however, remained obstinately stubborn, and it seemed, rather than risk capture, he was prepared to allow the U-boat to sink to the bottom, carrying the entire crew with her. Prisoners who witnessed this tense scene stated that Gengelbach's attitude infuriated Lawrence, who shouted, "Either you leave the boat or I do. I cannot take any more responsibility." This outburst had the desired effect, and Gengelbach then ordered the crew to put on life-saving apparatus and blow the tanks. With her remaining compressed air, U-574 reached the surface. Gengelbach's first intention was to attempt to escape above water, as the diesel engines had suffered no severe damage, but a burst of star shells and snowflakes greeted U-574 as she broke surface. Stork opened fire immediately, and it was soon obvious to the U-boat that they could not hope to steal away undetected. Gengelbach then gave the order to abandon ship whilst proceeding on her diesels. A number of reliable prisoners stated that Lorenz remained below, and after opening the valves to scuttle the U-boat, picked up his revolver and shot himself. A petty officer prisoner, who was one of the last to leave the U-boat, stated that although the bridge was raked by machine gun fire, no one was hit as they jumped overboard, which statement is contrary to Stork's report. This prisoner and others stated that Gengelbach made no attempt to save himself and did not bother to put on a life-saving jacket, and finally threw himself into the conning tower hatch and went down with his ship. According to prisoners, at least 26 men were drowned, some being so panic-stricken that they forgot to open air valves of their life-saving gear, and were therefore dragged down by the weight about their chests. Others were undoubtedly blown to pieces by depth charges intended to sink the U-boat as she was circling after being abandoned. One prisoner who was further away from the depth charges remarked that when they exploded, he felt as if he was swimming in soda water. Of the last stages of the sinking, Stork reported that she had just opened out for a third attack with depth charges set to deeper setting, and had turned and was running in when the U-boat surfaced about 200 yards ahead. She increased to full speed to ram and set a 10-charge pattern to 50 and 140 feet. The ensuing chase lasted 11 minutes, and there was later surprise to find by plotting that Stork had turned 3 complete circles. The U-boat appeared to be turning continuously to port inside Stork's turning circle at a speed only 2 or 3 knots less than the latter's best. She was kept illuminated by snowflakes, which were quite invaluable for this unusual action. Some 4-inch were fired from the forward mountings until the guns could not be sufficiently depressed, after which the guns' crews were reduced to fist-shaking and roaring curses at the enemy, who several times seemed to be a matter of feet rather than yards away. A burst or two of the half-inch machine gun were fired when these would bear, but the prettiest shooting, according to Stork, was made by the first lieutenant when a stripped Lewis gun over the top of the bridge screen. He quickly reduced the conning tower to a mortuary, for at this time no men were seen to be leaving the U-boat. Eventually, Stork managed to ram just before the conning tower from an angle of about 20 degrees on her starboard quarter, and rolled the U-boat over. She hung for a few seconds on the bow and again on the Asdic dome, and then scraped aft, where she was greeted by a 10-charge pattern, 9 only fired, at the shallowest settings. Commanding officer of Stork was informed. A Boche in the water, holding up his arms and crying, "Kamerad," received the contents of the starboard thrower in his face instead. Position at time of sinking was 38 degrees by 15 north, 17 degrees by 16 west. Stork proceeded to search for Stanley's survivors, and very soon heard cries for help which sounded English. At the time, it was thought highly improbable that there could be any U-boat survivors, but 5 were later picked up by Stork's boats and 13 by Samphire. Stork reported, "As soon as these were identified as Boches, I hoisted boats and proceeded at full speed to the estimated position of Stanley's wreck." There appeared to be little hope of finding any survivors, judging from the immensity of the conflagration, but cries from the water were shortly heard and 25 were rescued, one of whom died later. Samphire, who was picking up Germans, was called to assist, and was then left to search until after daylight, while Stork proceeded to rejoin the convoy. Only one further incident in this convoy's unusually eventful cruise directly affected the crew of U-574. At 0517 on 22nd December 1941, Deptford collided with Stork, striking the port side of the quarterdeck. Stork reported, "Deptford's stem walked straight into the temporary prison, and 2 of the 5 Boches were pulped, literally, into a bloody mess." Included in Stork's summing up of the adventures of convoy HG-76 is the remark, "Of all the U-boats encountered during the period, in which 3 and possibly 4 were sunk, U-boat C, U-574, was the only one which showed a vicious spirit of offense. The remainder were of the tip-and-run variety." Section 7. Technical details of U-574. U-574 was a 500-ton U-boat type 7C, one of the series numbers U-551 to U-643, built at the Blom and Voss yards, Hamburg. The captured U-570, now HMS Graf, was also of this series, and U-574 can therefore be considered identical with Graf in all main features. The following details are, however, considered of interest. Torpedoes. U-574 carried 14 torpedoes in all, 12 being electric and 2 air. The 2 air torpedoes were stowed in upper deck containers forward. The 12 electric torpedoes were distributed, 4 in the bow tubes, 4 in housings in the forward bilges, 2 on the floor plates in the bow compartment, 1 in the after tube, and 1 on the floor plates aft. A prisoner claimed some knowledge of the red and green markings on torpedoes. He said that the markings referred to the weight of the head, those with the red ring being stated to have the heavier head. The prisoner added that those torpedoes marked with a red ring would have as verstärkte Tiefeneinstellung, which probably indicated an increased depth setting, whereas those with green ring were stated to have an unverstärkte Tiefeneinstellung, that is, unincreased or normal depth setting. It was stated that when firing salvos, the interval of firing was between 2 and 3 seconds. S-Gerät, detector gear. U-574 was stated to have been fitted with a form of S-Gerät, which could be inclined 80 up and down and also sideways. This S-Gerät was stated to have a range of 400 meters and to be used only for detecting nets or minefields. Prisoners stated that a visual indicator, Matzscheibe, was employed. It was not often used for fear of betraying the U-boat's position. NID note: S-Gerät appears to cover all forms of transmitting detector apparatus. Echolot. U-574 was stated to use 2 kinds of echolots. The one used in depths up to 300 meters, graduated in meters, indicates directly in a depth gauge, is operated electrically, and can only be used vertically. The second echolot has no limit for depth. It operates acoustically and is also capable of being used vertically. Listening gear. Horchgerät. U-574's listening gear comprised 2 sets of microphones, 1 on each bow. NID note: this is evidently the GH multi-unit hydrophone and was probably the same as that in Graf. Wavelengths. A petty officer telegraphist stated that 3 different groups of wavelengths were employed, each group being referred to as a Schaltung group and carrying a special name such as Greenland, Iceland, or Ireland. Each group, Schaltung, was able to use 5 different wavelengths, including one of the longest. U-574 had used Ireland group in the 4 weeks of preceding her sinking. Vice Admiral commanding U-boats signals which group each boat shall use, and the date on which this group is to come into operation. Codes are supplied for a duration of 2 months. Connection between S-Gerät, detector gear, and Feuerleitung, firing installation. It was stated that there is no connection between the detector gear and the firing installation. Hydrophones were employed to obtain the bearing of the enemy ship, and her speed was estimated by the revolutions of the enemy's propellers. It was usual to aim with 1 degree additional ahead of the target. A chief petty officer responsible for this form of attack had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class. Depths. U-574's depth gauges were stated to be graduated to a maximum depth of 200 meters, with a danger mark at 180 meters. Countermeasures against British Asdics. The petty officer telegraphist stated that tests had been carried out on a U-boat with a rubber coating over the whole boat, the rubber being stated to have been a half-inch thick. These tests had not proved successful, as the rubber covering had considerably decreased the speed of the boat. Underwater sound apparatus, Anlage. A prisoner stated that U-574 was fitted with an underwater sound apparatus, Anlage, giving an effective range of 15 meters. It was stated that transmitters and receivers were fitted on both sides of the ship, and when commencing communication, both sides are used until the ship with which they wish to communicate is located, when one side is cut out. The frequencies employed for this apparatus in U-574 are not accurately known, but may have been the same as those employed in HMS Graf. Binoculars. A prisoner stated that U-boats carry two types of binoculars, one with a magnification of 7, as found in HMS Graf, and one pair for night use with less magnification, the power of which was not known. These binoculars were stated to be manufactured from a light metal and were not of normal Zeiss manufacture. Some prisoners stated that aircraft could be spotted up to a distance of 6 miles. Others stated that they could be seen up to the distance of the horizon, but this depended weather conditions. Prisoners added that the glasses became wet and required continual cleaning. Lookouts usually have a 90-degree sector for observation. Appendix: List of crew of U-574, etc. Survivors: Officers 4, Chief and Petty Officers 4, men 8, total 16. Casualties: Officers 2, Chief and Petty Officers 10, men 15, total 27. Total crew: Officers 6, Chief and Petty Officers 14, men 23, total 43. February 1942.